Hello everybody, and happy day after Thanksgiving. Since Red and I are both on a mini vacation of sorts, I thought it would be fun to cut the break in half with a little bit of dramatic poetry reading, just for, mild funsies. But anyway, today I have 4 poems for you all about Sparta from the poetry of one Constantine P. Cavafy, poet I've actually done some work with before on the channel, doing a little bit of readings. He is a Greek poet, lived in Alexandria in the early 1900s, loved writing poetry about classical history, so shouldn't be a surprise why he's one of my favorites. But without any further prevarication, let's jump into Thermopylae. Honor to those who in their life set out and guard Thermopylae, never wavering from duty, just and forthright in all their actions, though yet with mercy and compassion. Generous when rich, and when poor, still in small measure generous, helping again as they can. Always speaking forth the truth, yet without malice for the deceitful. A higher honor, indeed, is due, when they foresee, as many do, that Ephialtes will in the end appear, and the Medes will eventually break through. The following 2 poems are set about 100 years after the campaigns of Alexander and the mess that followed. So Sparta's military wasn't quite what it used to be by this point. Politically, its institutions were falling apart a little bit, the people were lazy, they liked luxury, they were basically falling prey to all of the same lavish impulses that plagued much of the Hellenistic world. But these poems focus on the character of King Cleomenes and also his mother to quite a large degree. And Cleomenes' big deal was that he saw that Sparta was in decline. Its military was nothing, its culture had fallen away from its ancient ideals, and he set about a series of reforms to try and bring Sparta back towards that old ideal that they embodied, and many of the things that are mentioned in the previous poem Thermopylae. And he also led a substantial campaign into the Peloponnese to try and reclaim some of the formerly Spartan land that was lost to Philip all those years beforehand. So his campaign's going well until it isn't, and then eventually he has to kind of look around and find out who he can get help from, so he goes to King Ptolemy III of Egypt and says, "Hey, I need some help," and he says, "All right, but on one condition." And the following 2 poems pick up with the aftermath of that. So here we are with In Sparta. King Cleomenes didn't know, he didn't dare, he didn't know how to say this to his mother, that Ptolemy demanded she too be sent to Egypt and kept a hostage as security for their arrangement, a highly humiliating, unbecoming thing. And he kept visiting her and always wavered, and always started to say something and always stopped. But that wonderful lady saw through him. Some rumors about it had reached her as well, and she encouraged him to speak out. And she laughed and said of course she'd go, and as a matter of fact, she was glad to be still useful to Sparta in her old age. As for the humiliation, well, she couldn't care less. A laggard, a king of only yesterday, was of course unable to grasp the Spartan spirit, wherefore his demand could not truly humble such a distinguished lady as she, mother of a Spartan king. I really like that poem. Next up is the second in that series, which, as opposed to the previous poem, which follows Cleomenes and his moment of weakness, the next poem, Come, O King of the Lacedaemonians, which are Spartans, follows predominantly the perspective of Cratisicleia, which is Cleomenes' mother. So here we go. Cratisicleia felt it beneath her to be seen by the people crying and lamenting, and she kept on walking in majestic dignity and silence, her imperturbable countenance displaying none of her consuming pains and sufferings. But even so, for one moment, she could bear it no more. Before embarking on that wretched ship for Alexandria, she took her son to the temple of Poseidon, and once they were alone, she embraced him and kept kissing him while he was in great pain, says Plutarch, and violent agitation. But her stalwart character prevailed, and regaining her composure, that wonderful woman said to Cleomenes, "Come, O king of the Lacedaemonians. When we are outside, nobody should see that we've been crying or doing anything unworthy of Sparta. That is the only thing still in our power. As for our fortunes, they will be with us as God might grant." And she entered the ship, on the way towards that might grant. Ultimately, even with all of Ptolemy's assistance, Sparta didn't win its war, and it was actually conquered by Macedon in the aftermath of that. But the very, very important silver lining to that story is that the whole Cleomenes arc is characteristic, archetypal Spartan virtue. The stuff that I read, the stuff that I didn't read that surrounds this whole story of Sparta's last hurrah is in many ways a very clear parallel to Thermopylae. And I could explain more, but that would just be me reciting my thesis. The bottom line is Cratisicleia and Cleomenes saw a bad situation when it was on their hands, and they made the best of it. They demonstrated true virtue. They brought Sparta back from its lazy and lavish lifestyle to something much more characteristic of the true ancient Spartan discipline and excellence that made it the amazing force in history that it was. And even though they lost and several thousand Spartans were killed, they all died warriors' deaths, which is the most that a true Spartan could ask for. So sometimes even when you lose, you really win. And as sort of an examination of that, this last poem about Sparta, the second to last one Cavafy even wrote before he died, called In the Year 200 BC, set 20 years after the death of Cleomenes and about 10 to 15 years before the Hellenistic world really falls apart and comes crashing down under the Roman boot. But this poem is a brilliant investigation, discussion, analysis, whatever, of how we view the past and how the past is still relevant even when it's been long since trampled on. So, tiny bit of context. The first line of this poem comes from an inscription made by Alexander the Great, along with some gifts he sent back to Greece while he was in Persia successfully campaigning against King Darius I. So, here is In the Year 200 BC. Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians. We can very well imagine how indifferent everybody was at Sparta to this inscription, except the Lacedaemonians. But naturally, the Spartans were not to be led and to be ordered about like prized servants. Anyway, a pan-Hellenic expedition without a Spartan king in command wouldn't seem to them of high repute. Well, of course, except the Lacedaemonians. This, too, is an attitude of life. It's understandable. So except the Lacedaemonians at Granicus, and then at Issus, and in the final battle where the awesome army was swept away, which the Persians had amassed at Arbela, which set out from Arbela for victory, and was swept away. And out of that wondrous pan-Hellenic expedition, the victorious, the most brilliant, the widely renowned, the praised for glory as no other has ever been praised, the incomparable we came to be. A new Hellenic world, a great one. We, the Alexandrians, the Antiochians, the Seleucians, and the numerous other Hellenes of Egypt and Syria, and those in Media and those in Persia and so many others, with their extended dominions and their various attempts at judicious adaptations, and the Greek Koine language, all the way to outer Bactria we carried it, to the peoples of India. Do we need to talk about the Lacedaemonians now? The irony is practically pouring off the page on this one. Again, not to go too, here's my thesis on you, but To the question of do we need to talk about the Lacedaemonians now, I think the course of history would imply that, yeah, we do. And not because, like the Hellenistic world, there are a ton of cities all over the place with the Greek Koine language and blah 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 whatever. No, the Spartans embodied an idea and a way of life that has persisted all throughout history after them. And that, even when Sparta the nation had become basically weak and irrelevant in the year 200 BC, that is why Sparta is and always will be still worth talking about.